In January 1974, Wichita, Kansas, woke to a crime that didn't make sense. The Otero family, father, mother, and 2 children, were found murdered in their modest suburban home. No forced entry, no robbery, only precision and control. Investigators saw signs of planning, but no clear motive. The case stunned a city that had rarely seen violence of this kind. The killer had watched the house for days. He waited until the family's morning routine was predictable. When he entered, he subdued them one by one, using knots and restraint instead of chaos. It wasn't rage. It was process. He later wrote that he took pride in his projects. The phrase itself would define him. BTK, bind, torture, kill. For months, the murders dominated Wichita news. Police followed dozens of false leads, drifters, ex-employees, anyone near the Otero home, but there was no match. The community began to move on, believing the killer had vanished. Then in 1977, 2 more women were found dead inside their homes. Same method, same cold preparation. The city realized BTK was back. Dennis Lynn Rader lived among them the entire time. A husband, father of 2, church council president, compliance officer for the local government. He lectured residents about lawn ordinances by day and photographed potential victims at night. Neighbors described him as polite, meticulous, maybe a little strict. No one guessed what discipline hid behind that calm exterior. Rader's need for control extended beyond his crimes. He wanted recognition. In 1978, he mailed a letter to a local TV station taking credit for the Otero murders and others. He named himself BTK and demanded attention. The tone was formal, almost bureaucratic. He complained that his story wasn't being told correctly. Wichita police realized they were dealing with someone who craved acknowledgement as much as violence. Detectives tried psychological profiling, then still a new concept. The profiler's assessment described a man in his 30s or 40s organized with a normal job and social life. He'd likely attend crime scene memorials, keep clippings, and follow news coverage. It was accurate, but there were thousands like him in Sedgwick County. In April 1979, BTK struck again. Anna Williams, his intended target, escaped by accident. She came home late, and Rader lost patience waiting. He left furious notes mocking police and the victim. The writings showed his arrogance, but also something else, fear of losing control. Detectives noticed his letters became less frequent and less detailed after each failure. For the next several years, BTK went quiet. In reality, Rader had started a family and was trying to live a double life. He worked at ADT Security, installing alarm systems for people terrified of the killer he secretly was. Ironically, many customers asked him for advice on how to stay safe from BTK. Rader played the part perfectly, empathetic, professional, reassuring. Inside, he was building a scrapbook of his crimes, photos, drawings, stolen items. Every trophy was cataloged and stored in his private files. Between 1985 and 1991, he killed 3 more women. Each time he adapted his method slightly, learning from mistakes. His victims were chosen through what he called projects, coded in his notes. He recorded surveillance details like entry points, schedules, and risk factors. To him, this was not impulse, it was engineering. The investigation, however, was losing hope. DNA testing was in its infancy. Without modern technology, police relied on witness statements, shoe prints, and handwriting. BTK's ability to disappear made him almost mythical. Newspapers referred to him as the Phantom of Wichita. For the city, BTK had become a ghost story told with locked doors and drawn curtains. By 1991, the killings stopped completely. Wichita breathed again. Children grew up, parents relaxed, and BTK faded into legend. Detectives retired without answers. The cold case files gathered dust in the evidence room, thick with frustration and handwritten notes reading, "No further leads." No one imagined the killer was still living a few miles away, now middle-aged, attending church every Sunday, and leading the local Boy Scout troop. Rader, meanwhile, lived quietly, but felt his identity slipping. Without new murders or letters, no one remembered BTK. He wrote in his journals that fame was drowning in time. His ego needed fuel. After more than a decade of silence, he decided to remind Wichita who he was. In 2004, a local newspaper ran a short anniversary piece about the unsolved BTK murders. The article speculated that the killer was likely dead or imprisoned for another crime. That single comment reignited Rader's obsession. He mailed a package to the paper containing photos of one of his victims and a copy of her missing driver's license. The return of BTK was official, and the Wichita Police Department reopened the case. Detectives, who had once been rookies, were now veterans leading new task forces. Technology had changed the game. DNA, digital records, and surveillance networks provided new weapons against an old ghost. What police didn't yet know was that BTK himself would hand them the clues they needed. Raiders started communicating again, this time through coded letters and puzzles sent to media outlets and investigators. He asked questions about whether modern technology could trace him. The arrogance returned, mixed with curiosity. He wanted to play cat and mouse, but the era had shifted. Every envelope, every disc, every word was data that could be analyzed. By late 2004, Wichita was on edge again. Citizens who barely remembered the first murders now lived under the shadow of the same initials. News anchors read BTK's messages aloud on television. Viewers analyzed his wording for clues. The hunt had gone digital, but so had his mistakes. In early 2005, BTK sent another package to a local TV station. Inside was a cereal box containing a note, a Barbie doll tied with rope, and a photocopy of a missing person's ID. The childish props disturbed investigators. It was the same twisted humor that had defined him decades earlier. But one small decision inside that package would be his downfall. And along with the doll, Rader included a computer disk labeled Test. He asked police in a previous message whether the disk could be traced. Investigators had replied publicly through the newspaper, saying it would be safe. Rader believed them. What he didn't realize was that digital forensics had evolved far beyond his understanding. When analysts examined the metadata on the disk, they found a name embedded in the file history: Christ Lutheran Church. Another line mentioned the user account, Dennis. A quick search revealed Dennis Rader, church president, living in nearby Park City. His address matched the region connected to several old crime scenes. Detectives began discreet surveillance. They photographed him at work, collected discarded trash, and confirmed his vehicles matched earlier witness reports. The evidence was stacking, but they needed proof that connected him to the original murders. Using a warrant, investigators obtained a DNA sample from his daughter's recent medical test. The lab compared it with DNA from preserved BTK evidence. The match was undeniable. Dennis Rader was BTK. On February 25, 2005, after more than 30 years, Wichita police pulled over Rader in his black Jeep Cherokee. The arrest was calm. He showed no resistance, no surprise, as if he knew the game had ended. At headquarters, detectives asked him one question: "Do you know why you're here?" Rader looked up and said, "I guess it's me." That quiet admission ended 3 decades of fear. What followed was one of the most disturbing confessions in modern criminal history. Over hours of interviews, Rader described each murder in detail: times, tools, and actions, with the detachment of a man explaining a routine task. He called his crimes projects and his victims targets. There was no remorse, only the satisfaction of explaining how he had outsmarted everyone for so long. Investigators were horrified at his precision. He kept meticulous notes, drawings, and even mock plans labeled with codes like Project Foxtail and Project Cookie. He said he studied serial killers and created his own Factor X, a supposed force that compelled him to kill. In reality, it was a justification for control and power. Rader wanted dominance, not death itself. When his confession reached the courtroom, Wichita listened in disbelief. The polite churchgoer, scout leader, and father of two calmly recounted how he murdered 10 people between 1974 and 1991. His tone was flat, his vocabulary measured. He showed no visible guilt, even describing how he paused during one killing to eat breakfast before returning to finish the job. The courtroom fell silent except for his steady voice. Rader pleaded guilty to all 10 counts of murder. During sentencing, family members of his victims spoke directly to him, demanding to know why. Rader gave the same rehearsed explanation, that he was driven by Factor X, that it was part of his dark side. The judge, visibly disturbed, sentenced him to 10 consecutive life terms. Kansas had abolished the death penalty for crimes before 1994, so execution was off the table. For many, that felt incomplete justice. After his sentencing, he was sent to El Dorado Correctional Facility. His life became routine again, only this time under strict supervision. He was allowed 1 hour outside his cell per day. He spent time writing letters to journalists and criminologists, still obsessed with the BTK identity. In those letters, he described himself as a monster compartmentalized within a family man. He wanted his story documented, not forgotten. The public's fascination didn't fade. Books, documentaries, and interviews tried to explain how an ordinary man could hide such a double life for decades. Psychologists called him a classic example of the organized serial pathology, a killer who plans, catalogs, and compartmentalizes. He functioned perfectly in society while committing horrors in secret. His neighbors and coworkers later said the realization felt like a bad movie come to life. For Wichita, the end of BTK brought relief, but also unease. The killer had never truly vanished. He had just blended in. Police reviewed how many times Rader had come close to exposure, neighbors' reports ignored, evidence mishandled, communications missed. The case became a study in criminal psychology and investigative persistence. It also showed how ego can undo even the most calculated criminal. In prison, Rader continued to seek attention. He corresponded with true crime authors, offering details in exchange for acknowledgement. Authorities limited his communication after he tried to mail graphic drawings. Even decades later, he described himself as BTK first, Dennis second. The persona he invented had consumed him. Outside the prison, his family tried to rebuild their lives. His wife filed for divorce immediately after his arrest. His daughter Carrie spoke publicly about the pain of discovering her father's identity. She recalled childhood memories that, in hindsight, took on a darker meaning. Her father's strange absences, his insistence on privacy, his rigid rules. Yet she also said she never saw signs of violence at home. That contradiction became part of what made Rader's case so disturbing. The complete normalcy masking complete evil. Today, Dennis Rader remains at El Dorado Correctional Facility, serving 10 consecutive life sentences without parole. He's in his late 70s, confined mostly to a small cell. His letters have slowed. His name rarely appears in headlines, but BTK's shadow still lingers in true crime discussions. Investigators occasionally review unsolved Kansas cases to see if any match his methods, but so far, all known victims are accounted for. The BTK case left deep marks on how American law enforcement approaches serial crimes. It highlighted the importance of forensic technology, public communication, and psychological profiling. But more than that, it reminded the public that monsters rarely look like monsters. They hold jobs, attend church, mow their lawns, and wave to neighbors. Rader proved that evil can exist behind a calm smile, and sometimes that's what makes it most terrifying. As one retired detective later said, "We weren't hunting a killer. We were hunting normal."